Hi, and welcome back to the living room. I appreciate you coming over for another visit. Behind us, we have a couple of blooms. Iris over there in the corner, Tadia's little pixie crossed with Zuma's pixie, or something. Tadia's little pretty crossed with Zuma's pixie. And then we have the, I don't know what that Cattley's name is to save my life. I think it's Volcano something, but anyway. I was going around looking at my plants today and I was like, well, you need to be repotted. You're going to need repotting. Oh, it's time for you to be repotted. And there are so many different types of media that we can use for our orchids depending on our environment, depending on the orchid itself, what they require, whether they require a wet-dry cycle, whether they require staying more wet or moist. I know a lot of people don't like that word. So I thought, well, you know, spring is right around the corner, so let's talk about the different types of media that we can use as orchid growers to give our orchids the best chance of growing during the growing season, which is coming up, possibly blooming for us, which is what we all hope for, and depending on our environment, which is more successful. So if you end up enjoying the video, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. Thank you to everyone who has subscribed, especially during my hiatus, so to speak, and we'll talk about that in a different video as far as where I've been, why I've been gone, why I haven't been posting, you know, all that stuff that nobody really cares about, but I feel the need to share. Leave your comments down below on the media that you prefer in your growing environment, what you found successful. Now let's just jump right in. Okay. So before us, we have the different types of media that I grow in. There's one that I don't grow in. We'll cover that when we get to it. But let's just start with bark. Bark is probably the most popular orchid media that we can use, and we have two different types of bark actually. I prefer this bark here. This, as you can see, has big chunky pieces in it. It's got the big chunky perlite. You can add charcoal to this. I don't have any small charcoal, but that's another growing media that you can use. It is not a wicking media, the charcoal. It does help keep the media sweet, as in, you know, kind of killing things that aren't good for your orchid. That hasn't really been proved to me yet, but a lot of people are saying it. So it must be true, right? Anyway, you have to make your own decisions on things. But this orchid mix here, I really love for my big-rooted orchids. Your Phalaenopsis, your Cattleyas, some Dendrobiums prefer a more airy mix. But I really, really like this one. And I recently repotted my, what I call the Art Deco. And if I have a picture, I'll put it up. I recently repotted her in one of my new orchid pots that I bought from Lowe's by Allen & Roth, no sponsorship. But as you can see, it's nice and airy, lots of room for those large roots to grow in, and you can kind of see all the different perlite and the charcoal. There's charcoal in here, and then the larger bark. Now, the other type of bark, and this I get from my local nursery here in Colorado. It's called Nick's Nursery. This here is the Miracle Grow mix. Now, why do I have this if I don't like it? Well, my nursery was out of the larger bark that I like. I needed to repot a plant, and I went and got this. As you can see, excuse me, it's just bark chips, and they're rather flat, and not, I don't think they're very qualitative, to be honest with you. But I did repot my Horus Maxima, excuse me, in this mix, as you can see. But the little bit of this bark with the larger pieces and the large perlite that I had left, I did add it into the mix. That's where some of it is in there, but the bulk of this is this stuff here. And as you can see, I can break it, and this is new. This has only been in here less than a month. So here's one of those. I can just break it in half, and then here's a kind of flat piece of the charcoal that I like to use, and you can see it's hard to do. If you hear a little pitter-pattering, that's my little puppies running around. I am going to repot this girl, though, into the larger bark now that I have some, just because I'm afraid that this bark, one, is going to break down much quicker, and just because, look how cheap it is. Look at that. This type might be good for like your smaller rooted orchids, your oncidiums. What else has small roots? I can't think of another one, but right now your oncidiums. Because this media, once it starts absorbing water more readily, will probably hold on to the water a little bit longer, so you have your aeration and your moisture retention. I don't like that one. So like I said, I will be repotting my Horus Maxima. And then we also have charcoal rock, okay? These are the larger rock pieces that you can get. They're very much like lava rock, but they're made out of the charcoal. And this is horticultural charcoal. Very difficult word for me today. And I do have a Cattleya because they do like the wet dry cycle. And like I said, charcoal doesn't really hold on to water that long. It's not super absorbent. So this is the white Cattleya that I put in here let's see, probably about 2 months ago. And as you can see, she's growing into the roots. The roots are growing into that media. Now the drawback with this media, because it is kind of coarse, is when you go to repot, the chances of root damage are a lot greater just because they will wrap themselves around, and as you can kind of see, it's really coarse. It's not nice and smooth. So it'll be more difficult to get roots off of media like that. So the bark and the charcoal are really ideal for places that have high humidity, just because they will dry out a lot quicker, so they won't hold that moisture too long. Now, if you live in a drier climate, then Coco Husk, which has become pretty popular over the last year or so, is a good media to use because it does hold water much longer, like our Sphagnum Moss, which I will talk about here in a minute. Zygopetalums. I'm trying my Zygopetalum in the Coco Husk, hoping to recover it. And as you can see, she looks really, really sad right now. And I did lose one of my new growths because I was trying to pull back a sheath to let a root out, and I ended up breaking the new growth. But this is what the Coco Husk looks like when it's dry. Now this does have to be cured depending on where you get it, because it is high in salt, as the name suggests. It's Coco Husk grown on, from cocoa trees. Very salty because they do live in tropical areas where the wind blows the salt from the waters. Some people do grow in just rock, varying sizes of rock. I don't have any big pieces because I don't grow orchids in rock. But again, this would be a good media if you have a high humidity area. As you can water, it'll drain. The rocks don't hold any moisture, so I wouldn't suggest using this for like oncidiums, zygopetalums, paphiopedilums, phragmipediums, those things that like to stay more wet. But for like our orchids such as your Phalaenopsis or your Cattleya, might work well for you, depending again on your environment. My environment is too dry. I do grow in my home. I would not use rocks as a sole media. Another media you can use is the perlite, not the little itty bitty perlite, but like the bigger perlites that come in the mixes. You can do. I have this Phalaenopsis that I put in here in July of 2021, and I treat her pretty much in like a self-watering kind of leca setup. So I don't know if you can really see the big pieces of perlite in there, but I do have small rock on top to help hold the moisture in. And as you can see, she's doing rather lovely. She has this root growing out here. She's got all kinds of roots on top. She's grown 2 leaves since I've put her in here. And I do have rock at the bottom, and then there's water in there right now because this is the week that I leave the water at the bottom and so that she can hydrate. And then I take and pour the water out and leave just enough in there to keep the wick wet, same as what you do with leca, so that it doesn't completely dry out. But this way it kind of gives her that wet dry cycle that Phalaenopsis like. Now Phalaenopsis, you can keep their roots wet all the time if you're careful. Now there are a couple of Phalaenopsis that I currently have in water culture just because I'm trying to rejuvenate some leaves and rejuvenate the roots and keeping an eye on it. It's kind of an experiment. That's another media you can use water, but you have to really watch your orchid, make sure you're taking out any rotting material that might be in there to keep mold from building. You want to make sure you're changing your water out frequently. Currently, I have mine in where they sit in the water for 3 days, and then I dry them out for 2 days, and then start the cycle over. I do add fertilizer once a week to that, so when they're doing the 3-day soak, they do have that fertilizer in there, and then the 2 days that they dry out, obviously no fertilizer. The next 3 days that they have, I don't put any fertilizer in there, and then repeat the cycle. If you do water culture, leave in the comments down below the best practices that you found that work best for you as far as transitioning an orchid, recovering an orchid, so on and so forth. Now, since we just talked about leca, or I mentioned leca, so I didn't have any dry leca on hand, but this is what leca looks like when it's wet. It is a clay pebble, and depending on where you get your leca will determine how much you have to do to prep it. So what I do with my leca is I boil it twice for 20 minutes on a high boil. Then I will soak it for 2 to 3 days, changing the water out every 24 hours. And then I'll boil it again and then soak it for another 24 hours. And by that time, the pH has gone down enough and all the salt buildup and everything is out. Now, the good thing about inorganic media, like your leca, your rock, is it doesn't break down. You can reuse it, which is helpful and economical. I currently am thinking of changing the bulk of my collection to leca. Not all of it, of course. Right now I'm not in a position to do that. It does get a little heavy, so you do have to be careful with that. But what dry leca looks like is, I do have one here. So this is your dry leca. As you can see, it just looks like a little piece of dry clay. It is wicking. Once you cure it, you never want to let it really stay dry too long. You want to kind of leave it wet while you're storing it. So this Phalaenopsis here, I transitioned into leca last June of 2021, and she is doing amazing. Look at this. So she's grown this leaf first, then she grew this one, and now she's working on a new leaf here. She has all kinds of roots here on the top. She's got one that's moving around. But as you can see, there you go. This root right here and this one back here, can you see that? Those two roots basically sit in water all the time, because even when I'm giving her her dry out cycle, she has these roots, especially this one, still sitting in water. And as you can see, it's still growing. I always keep just a little bit of water at the bottom to keep my wick from drying completely out. Again, leca would be a good setup probably for more dry environments, and it would probably help in humid environments as well. A lot of people around the world in different environments do use it. I do know that Nina from Ninja's Orchids has all of her orchid collection, except for those that might be new or she's waiting for different things to happen before she can put them in leca. The important thing when you are changing a media is to wait for new root growth, so that if the existing roots reject the repot, and I use that word reject because some people say, oh, well, they don't like the media. No, it's a different media than what they got used to. So you always want to wait for new root growth before you change the media. That is something that I learned a very valuable lesson last year, because I lost an orchid or so transitioning prior to that new root growth. But once you see that new root growth, those are the ones that are going to adapt to your new setup. So very important to remember. And then last but not least, the second most popular, I think, is Sphagnum Moss. Now, there are some small pieces of perlite in here. I used up all my small perlite, so I didn't have it separate to use. But this is just what I do with my moss after I've soaked it and wet it. I add charcoal and perlite into it, so it's already kind of pre-prepped for me to use. The cool thing about moss is it will spread the moisture in your pot evenly. You can water from the top, but when you water from the top, you're going to compact it and kill all the air pockets that are in there. So the best practice is to just set it in the water, let it absorb from the bottom up, because it is very wicking and it'll spread the water throughout and keep the moisture even. And I have this oncidium here that is in the moss, charcoal, and perlite setup. And as you can see, it's very evenly distributed throughout the pot. So another thing I really like about moss, and I know a lot of people don't like moss, especially since the charcoal has come out. Not charcoal, the Coco Husk has become more popular. I can tell when my orchid is dry by looking at my pot. So what I'll do is I'll watch it, and as sections start getting dry, and then of course by the weight, the more you have a plant that you pick up a lot, you can kind of tell when they need watering and when they don't, not necessarily just by looking at the pot itself. But once the entire outside is fairly dry, then I will go ahead and set her in some water, leave her in there until she soaks about halfway up, and then I take her out, and then the rest of it will distribute around. And as you can see, she has a lot of new root growth going on in there. Now you can, and most people do, use a combination of sphagnum moss and bark chips, or they'll add some perlite with moss and charcoal, and then large or small bark. Another type of bark you can use, I don't have any right now, but we'll just use this orchid right here since she's right here. But you can do small bark as well. Let me grab some here. So this isn't seedling bark, but it's small fir bark, and that works really well for me in my environment here in my home in Colorado, for like seedlings or small rooted orchids, or orchids that I'm trying to recover and I want the media to stay a little more moist, because they're smaller pieces. Once they can kind of start absorbing, they will keep that moisture a little bit longer. That is something that you have to look out for. So leave in the comments below what your favorite media is for a specific orchid, or do you use one type of media for all your orchids? Do you use a combination? What is your environment like? And how many orchids do you have to repot this spring? So far I've counted 10 with like 5 possibles. Guys, I hope this was interesting for you. Go ahead, like I said, leave comments down below, give the video a like, subscribe if you haven't, and we will see you on the next one.